Gauss Maxima.
All right, Chamber of Theories. We're going to be diving into like something that has always bothered me, and it might have bothered you too.
Okay.
Okay. And that is why didn't other countries help Britain during like either of the Wizarding Wars with Voldemort? He wasn't exactly subtle. Like the guy had an ego the size of a planet and was clearly like aiming for world domination.
Oh, totally.
So you'd think every Ministry of Magic would have been like tripping over themselves to lend a wand, right?
Yeah, it does seem that way on the surface, but I think there are actually some really compelling reasons why that might not have been the case.
Okay.
Let's start with like the most obvious one. Maybe other countries just didn't know how bad things were.
I mean, they just didn't know. Like Voldemort was terrorizing the whole country.
I know it seems crazy, but Voldemort and the Death Eaters were very good at keeping things quiet, especially during the Second War. They learned from their mistakes the first time around, and they got really good at like propaganda, and they infiltrated the Ministry of Magic, remember?
Oh, yeah.
And they controlled the press with the Daily Prophet. Like anyone who spoke out against them was silenced.
So classic control the narrative then.
Pretty much. And we also have to remember that other countries had their own problems to deal with.
Right.
There are over 100 wizarding governments out there, each with its own set of challenges. So it's possible that Voldemort's rise to power in Britain just didn't seem like a big deal on a global scale at first.
Okay, so maybe other countries were just kind of in the dark. But what if they knew what was happening and just chose not to get involved?
Right.
Like, that's kind of dark, isn't it?
It is. And it leads us to a question that might make some Potterheads a little uncomfortable.
Okay.
What if Wizarding Britain had a bit of a reputation problem? What if other countries had good reason to be hesitant about helping them?
Wait, you're saying Wizarding Britain was like the bad boy of the wizarding world?
Well, let's look at some of their institutions and see.
Okay.
For example, the Ministry of Magic, riddled with corruption and incompetence.
Like, remember Lucius Malfoy?
Yeah.
Death Eater? And he held a high-ranking position in the ministry? And their control over the Daily Prophet really makes you question their commitment to a free press and transparency.
Right.
Does that sound like a government you'd want to support?
Yeah. No, not really.
And then there's Hogwarts, a school that's supposed to be all about values and tradition. But don't forget about Slytherin House and their whole philosophy of pure blood supremacy.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine a school where one of the main houses is dedicated to teaching kids that they're better than everyone else because of their bloodline.
Ugh, that's a huge red flag.
It is. And then to top it all off, you have Azkaban, where they use Dementors as guards.
Oh gosh, yeah.
A prison where the guards literally suck the happiness out of you.
It's horrible.
That doesn't really seem like a justice system. It's more like a horror movie.
Yeah.
So from an outsider's perspective, Wizarding Britain might have looked like a very intolerant and xenophobic place.
A place with a serious human rights problem. And if that's the image they were projecting, it's no wonder other countries might have been reluctant to help.
Wow. I never thought of it that way. It really makes you question whether Wizarding Britain was deserving of international support.
Right. But it gets even more complicated because we've talked about how other countries might not have known how bad things were. And we've talked about their hesitation to help because of Britain's reputation. But there's a third and even more unsettling possibility.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
What if some countries actually agreed with Voldemort? At least a little bit.
Seriously? You think some wizarding governments might have sympathized with his pure-blood mania?
I know it sounds crazy, but when you dig a little deeper, it actually starts to make a bit more sense.
Okay.
Pureblood supremacy may not have been as universally condemned in other wizarding cultures as it was in Britain. A lot of historical wizarding societies were much more conservative and closed off, with really strict rules about blood purity and interacting with muggles. So Voldemort's ideas, while extreme, might not have seemed that radical in some parts of the world.
So you're saying that context matters?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it really makes you think about the global wizarding community and how they might have responded to Voldemort differently.
Yeah.
Did some countries passively condone his actions? Did they maybe even actively support him?
Whoa.
Or were they just too afraid to oppose him? These are all questions worth considering.
Definitely. This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about the Wizarding Wars.
Yeah, it's a lot more complicated than it seems at first glance.
That's for sure. It's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, and each layer is more disturbing than the last.
It's a tough pill to swallow, isn't it? The idea that some wizarding governments might have actually looked at Voldemort and seen some of their own beliefs reflected back at them.
Right. Even if those beliefs were like totally messed up.
Exactly. It forces us to confront the fact that prejudice and intolerance can exist even in a world of magic and wonder.
It also makes you wonder, like, what would have happened if Voldemort had won?
Oh, yeah.
Would these sympathetic countries have joined him? Would they have helped him create this new world order ruled by pure-blood wizards?
It's a chilling thought, and it really highlights why it's so important to understand the motivations and ideologies of people who might be drawn to a figure like Voldemort.
Yeah, like what makes them vulnerable to that kind of hate and division?
Right. What are the historical and cultural factors that shape their worldview?
It's like we keep peeling back the layers of this onion, and every layer is more disturbing than the last.
I know. And speaking of layers, let's go back to Wizarding Britain for a second. We've talked about the Ministry Hogwarts Azkaban, but there's another aspect of their society that might have made other countries hesitant to help.
What's that?
Their treatment of magical creatures.
Like the house elves. Everyone knows how badly they were treated.
Right.
And what about the centaurs and goblins? They never really seemed to be fully accepted by the wizarding world.
Exactly. Remember that statue Harry sees at the Ministry of Magic? The Fountain of Magical Brethren?
Yeah, vaguely.
It depicts a wizard and witch standing tall and proud, while a centaur, a goblin, and a house elf are looking up at them adoringly.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It always seemed a little condescending.
Yeah. To someone from Britain, it might seem like a harmless representation of unity and harmony, but to an outsider, it could easily be interpreted as a symbol of wizarding supremacy.
Yeah, like, hey, magical creatures, we're in charge, so be grateful.
Right. And that kind of message wouldn't exactly inspire confidence in other magical beings. It suggests that wizards are at the top of the hierarchy and everyone else is beneath them.
So basically, Wizarding Britain wasn't exactly sending out the we're all in this together vibe.
Not really. And that brings us to another important point. We've been focusing on Wizarding Britain's internal issues, but we also need to consider the bigger picture of international relations.
Okay.
Wizarding governments, just like Muggle governments, often act out of self-interest.
So you're saying that even if other countries knew about what was happening in Britain, they might have chosen to ignore it because it wasn't in their best interest to get involved.
It's a possibility. Think about it. Intervening in another country's affairs is risky.
Yeah.
It can lead to political fallout, economic sanctions, even war. And what if those countries had their own problems to deal with? What if they thought that getting involved in Britain's war against Voldemort would only make things worse for them?
So maybe they were more worried about protecting themselves than about doing the right thing.
It's a harsh truth, but it's often the reality of international politics. And then there's the idea of appeasement.
Appeasement, like giving in to a bully, hoping to leave you alone.
Exactly. History is full of examples of appeasement, and it rarely ends well. But when faced with a threat like Voldemort, some countries might have calculated that it was better to stay silent and hope he didn't come after them.
That's a terrifying thought.
Exactly. It reminds us that even doing nothing can have serious consequences.
This whole conversation is making me realize how much more there is to the Wizarding Wars than we see in the books.
Me too.
It's not just good versus evil. It's this tangled web of politics, culture, and morality.
And it makes us think about our own role in the world. What would we do if we were in a similar situation? Would we stand up for what's right, even if it meant putting ourselves at risk?
Those are tough questions.
They are.
Okay, Chamber of Theories, that was a lot to take in. We've really gone deep, haven't we? Exploring all the reasons why other countries might have let Voldemort just run wild in Britain.
Yeah, we've definitely challenged some assumptions about how the global wizarding community dealt with Voldemort's rise to power. And it looks like things were a lot more complicated than just good versus evil.
Right. Like maybe there was some ignorance, maybe some countries who were just looking out for themselves, and maybe even some darker stuff going on.
Absolutely. It's not black and white. It's this whole mix of different motivations, ideologies, and maybe even a bit of self-preservation.
Yeah, so much for that united front of good wizards fighting evil that we all imagined as kids.
I know, right? But I think that's why this is so interesting. By looking at these uncomfortable truths, we get a better understanding of how the wizarding world works. Like, even with magic and all, there's still politics, moral compromises, and tough choices to make.
Yeah, and those choices are sometimes the choice to not do something can have huge consequences. So let's bring it back to the original question. Why should all of you watching care about this lack of help during the Wizarding Wars? What's the takeaway here?
I think it really makes us think about what countries and even just regular people should do when faced with a global threat. Like, what would we do in that situation? Would we do what's right, even if it meant putting ourselves at risk? Or would we just look out for ourselves and hope for the best? It's something to really think about.
It's like looking at a mirror image of our own world, isn't it?
Yeah.
We see these same problems happening all the time. Countries trying to decide whether to get involved in conflicts. People trying to decide whether to speak out against injustice. The wizarding wars might be made up, but the questions they raise are really important.
Definitely. And we have to remember that history tends to repeat itself. If we don't learn from the mistakes of the past, we'll probably just make them again.
Yeah.
So by understanding what happened during the Wizarding Wars, maybe we can be more aware of these same forces at work in our own world.
So, Chamber of Theories, we've covered a lot today. From other governments not knowing what was happening, to maybe even agreeing with Voldemort, it's been pretty intense. What are your thoughts on all this? Should other countries have helped Britain? Was Wizarding Britain just too messed up for anyone to want to get involved? Or was something even worse happening behind the scenes? Let's talk about it in the comments below.
Yeah, let's see what you all think.
And while you're down there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. And here's one last thing to think about. What if Voldemort's rise to power wasn't just some random thing? What if it showed a much bigger problem in the wizarding world, something that's still there today? Could there be another Voldemort out there just waiting to take advantage of the same weaknesses? Something to think about, isn't it?
Definitely something to ponder.
Until next time, keep those wands at the ready. And remember, the chamber awaits.
Lumos Maxima.